Audeze has been making a lot of moves lately. First, they came out with their first electrostatic headphone, the Carbon, and now they've come out with a new flagship, the LCD-5, which replaces the previous LCD-4. So today we're going to be doing our first impressions of Audeze's top-of-the-line planar magnetic headphone. Now, I do want to send a quick thank you to Audeze for lending this to me for this video and also a review. So with this new headphone, it's got a lot of new features that we haven't really seen before on other Audeze headphones. And in fact, so much has changed that it might be easier to talk about what hasn't changed on this than what has. Now, pretty much the only thing that's consistent between this headphone and the previous generation is the 4-pin mini XLR in the back. This is a very different chassis than we've seen before. It's a lot smaller than the previous generations are. The headband structure is quite a bit different. There's a lot going on here, a lot of new stuff, and I'm curious how people are going to react to it. One of the really important and I think kind of welcome changes from most people is going to be the new standard of weight for these. These are very light compared to the previous generation. The LCD-4 was about 690 grams, which, as a quick side note, they actually no longer sell the LCD-4, so rest in peace, a classic staple of hi-fi headphones for sure. The LCD-5 manages to wipe off a whopping 270 grams, going down to about 490 grams, which is pretty lightweight for a big planar like this. And I think this is a wonderful move. I think this will be pretty much universally appreciated. The main complaint I hear about Audeze's across the board is weight. A lot of people complain about the weight because they can't wear it for a long time. This really does a lot to change that. You can wear this thing for hours and it's not fatiguing at all. Another interesting feature is this crazy mirror-like finish on the drivers on the insides here. I'm gonna see if I can capture this well on video, but it looks unlike any other planar that I've ever seen. It's very cool. Now, if you've owned an Audeze before, I think one of the most immediate changes you might notice when picking this up, aside from the weight, aside from the different looks, is the change in pads. And for the first time in a while, they're actually changing the shape of the pads quite a lot. These are unfortunately glued on, which I think is a big no-no personally, especially for a really expensive headphone like this. I think these should be magnetic or, something that just feels a little bit more premium than glue, personally. Now, the pads here are what I consider to be a mix of old school Audeze pads and actually Abyss pads. The reason why is because they're no longer this flat surface that touches the inside of your ear. It actually goes from this round shape to this thinner portion on the pad all around the outer circumference of that pad. So it kind of tapers inward a lot like we've seen with Abyss's Diana series. Now, the benefit here is that this, matched with the kind of lesser weight of this new one, means that this headphone is very comfortable. Okay, there are a couple other build things that I want to talk about, but I'll save those for the full review. Let's talk about the sound. I want to talk about a couple things in particular, but I'm going to gloss over some areas because I haven't quite figured out how I feel about them, and I'll analyze those in the full review. This says the most unique sounding LCD, and what I mean by that is this one stands out from the pack the most. It is the most different from any other LCD that I've heard. Honestly, it doesn't even necessarily carry what I would deem the house sound of Audeze. Now, this may be the new standard that everything will follow, and if Audeze decides to do that, that's fine, but as this headphone stands, it's definitely different. One of the standout features for this headphone among the previous generations is that mid-range really seems to be the focus. Now, another big thing about this headphone that I haven't seen on previous Audeze's is an incredible, really incredible top end and mid-range dynamic range. Now, the previous gen flagship, the LCD-4, had incredible dynamics, but it was really centralized around the bass response. That was the most dynamic area of that headphone, and it sounded incredible because of it. Now, I'm going to kind of put a hard stop on this. I wouldn't expect this headphone to replace the dynamic bass capability of that headphone. This is a much more mid-range focused, much more top-end focused sound than that previous generation was. Now, this could either be the most welcomed change or the most controversial. Here are the two sides of this. One welcome change would be well, they've already kind of done it, right? We don't want to keep getting the same iteration of the same type of sound signature with no variation. That's not very exciting as a customer, and I would kind of agree with that. But I also see the other side of saying, well, we buy Audeze because of this. And this being a departure, it may not be what everybody's cup of tea is. I will be very blunt here. This has what I consider to be far less bass than the LCD-4 had. The LCD-4 was revered as being one of the longest reigning champs of bass in hi-fi headphones. And for me, even to this day, it is probably the best bass headphone, very closely tied with something like an AB1266TC with it's just the best bass, I think. Now, one thing I do want to mention here is that burn-in did seem to be an important aspect of this headphone. Right out of the box, this headphone sounded very compressed, very crunchy, and then like over the course of, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours of listening, it really went and kind of opened up, you know, and started being a lot more dynamic in the mid-range. And it went from being a really kind of tight sounding headphones, just like tightly wound, didn't seem very free and open, to being a very, very dynamic headphone. The reason why I bring this up is because I'm wondering if through further listening, before I get to the final review, if the dynamics of the bass will also expand. I don't think it could expand quite that much, but we'll see. Now the mids and treble are very impressive. The treble is somewhat confusing because it's got that sort of delivery where you're definitely hearing things that have treble in them, but it's also not drawing too much attention to itself. It's really kind of got this balancing act of not drawing any focus there, but also not ignoring it altogether. It's very nice. It's not nearly as dark as previous gen LCDs are either, by the way, if you're familiar with those. Vocal timbre seems to be very natural and clear above anything else. It doesn't seem to have a leaning towards any kind of wooden roundness, metallic twang, or kind of shiny thinness. It's very clear and super realistic. I actually really personally like this style of vocals, so I think this is a good move. Okay, so one focus, like the main bullet point of my first impressions here though, are the dynamics, and they're dynamics in a specific area, and I kind of want to talk about my childhood a little bit here. Now, when I was growing up, my biological dad played drums. I got very used to the sound of drums. I know what drums sound like. To be completely frank, most headphones kind of suck for drums. They can do it. You can get a reasonably good interpretation of it. But in my experience, most of the times it takes a very, very dynamic and very capable speaker to really produce something that is even remotely close to a real drum performance. This is probably the best drums I've heard on a headphone. Like just the raw power of the body of the drum, not the bass, not the resonance at the top end. It's not any of that. It's the raw punch, that impact, that initial burst. And that all pretty much happens in the mid-range for most drums. And that was very, very impressive on this. It immediately shot me back to my childhood when I was listening to it. And in those limited drum circumstances, listening to something like Tool is just an amazingly enjoyable experience with this headphone. I find the drums on here to be very, very good. So I think I'm going to leave the first impressions there. I have a lot more thoughts on this, but I really want to hone down, do some comparisons in the full review. So that's what I'll do. Okay, guys, thanks a lot for watching. Until next video. Peace.